I was lying on the kitchen floor, my hip shattered, my phone trembling in my hand, when I heard my daughter-in-law whisper through the speaker, "Don't pick up. Let her crawl to the hospital." My son said nothing. The call went dead. In that moment, I realized the woman who had raised a family, built a home, and sacrificed everything was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was an obstacle, a burden, something to be removed, and that was only the beginning of what they tried to take from me. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Wilson, and I am 72 years old. I have lived in the same wooden house by the ocean in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, for more than 3 decades. The salt air still drifts through my windows every morning, carrying the scent of the sea and memories of a life I once shared with my husband. We built this house together when we were young, hammering the boards with our own hands, dreaming about growing old here. He passed away 12 years ago from heart failure, leaving me with a quiet home and a lifetime of memories. For most of my life, I worked as a head nurse at the local hospital. The job was demanding, but I took pride in caring for others. Long shifts, sleepless nights, and endless responsibility became my routine. After my husband died, I raised our only son, Ethan, on my own. I made sure he had everything he needed, even if it meant sacrificing my own comfort. I believed that hard work and dedication were the foundations of a strong family. When I finally retired, I expected to enjoy a peaceful life. My days became slower, filled with gardening, church activities, and volunteering to help elderly neighbors who lived alone. I kept my husband's old tools in the shed, though I rarely touched them. Sometimes I would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the waves roll in and thinking about how quickly time had passed. Ethan grew up, went to college à Vichy, and eventually married a woman named Claire. She was ambitious and confident, with a sharp sense of style and a strong desire for financial success. When they wanted to buy a house, I sold my smaller rental property to help them afford the down payment. I believed that supporting my son was an investment in our family's future. At the time, I never questioned whether that generosity would one day be used against me. At first, Claire was polite, though distant. Our conversations felt formal, almost like business exchanges. Over time, I noticed that Ethan began to change. He called less often, and when he did, his voice sounded rushed. Decisions that used to involve both of us were now made by Claire alone. I told myself this was normal. Families change, I thought. Children grow up. Still, there were moments when I felt like a guest in my own son's life. Visits became shorter. Invitations grew rare. Claire's tone carried an edge of impatience whenever I asked simple questions. I tried not to take it personally. After all, I had lived long enough to understand that not every relationship stays warm forever. Despite the distance, I continued to believe in family loyalty. I believed that no matter how busy Ethan became, he would always be there when I truly needed him. I had spent my life caring for others, and I trusted that kindness would eventually return to me. My house remained my sanctuary. The walls held photographs of happier days, framed moments of birthdays, graduations, and quiet evenings by the fireplace. Each room carried the weight of memories, especially the bedroom where my husband and I once slept side by side. That space still felt sacred to me, untouched by time. Yet, beneath the calm surface of my routine, something felt unsettled. The silence in my home was no longer comforting. It was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. I sensed that my place in my son's world was slipping, though I could not yet understand why. I never imagined that one rainy evening would reveal the truth so brutally. I never imagined that the family I had built with love and sacrifice would become the source of my greatest heartbreak. At that moment, I still believed that blood meant loyalty, and that a mother's devotion would always be returned with respect. I was wrong. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of what just happened, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what came next was not just painful, it was a complete betrayal. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping in from the Atlantic with heavy rain and sharp winds that rattled the windows of my house. Cape Cod had always been unpredictable in the fall, but that evening felt especially harsh. I had spent the day alone, listening to the weather reports and making sure everything outside was secured. As the rain intensified, I noticed that one of the porch windows had been left slightly open, letting cold air and moisture drift inside. I grabbed my coat and stepped onto the wooden stairs to close it. The boards were slick from the rain, darker than usual, and glistening under the dim porch light. I had walked those steps thousands of times over the years without a second thought. That night, however, my foot slipped the moment I shifted my weight forward. I felt myself fall hard against the railing before crashing onto the steps. A sharp pain shot through my hip and lower back, stilling the breath from my lungs. For a few seconds, I could not even scream. The rain soaked through my clothes, and the cold air pressed against my skin. I tried to move, but my body refused to respond. Every attempt sent waves of pain through me. My phone had fallen a short distance away, resting near the edge of the porch. I stretched my arm, inch by inch, until my fingers finally brushed against it. My hands were shaking, but I managed to unlock the screen. In that moment, I did not think about pride or independence. I thought about my son. I believed Ethan would come if he knew I was hurt. The call rang several times before he answered. I tried to speak clearly, even as my voice trembled from the pain and the cold. I told him that I had fallen and could not get up. I asked him to come. Through the phone, I heard a familiar voice in the background. Claire's tone was low, but every word cut sharply through the storm. She told him not to pick up, not to get involved. She said I could make my own way to the hospital. She even mentioned that they needed the guest room for her parents. Her words were calm, almost dismissive, as if my pain were nothing more than an inconvenience. Ethan did not argue. He did not defend me. The line went silent, and then the call ended. I stared at the dark sky above me, the rain blurring my vision. My body hurt, but the ache in my chest was far worse. I had spent my entire life caring for others, especially my son. I had worked through exhaustion, grief, and sacrifice to give him a stable future, yet in the moment I needed him most, he chose silence. The storm continued to pour, soaking the wooden steps and my clothes. My bones felt heavy, and the cold began to settle deep inside me. I realized that waiting for help from my family would only make things worse. With trembling hands, I called emergency services. As I lay there, listening to the distant sound of sirens approaching, memories of my past flooded my mind. I remembered carrying Ethan when he was sick as a child, staying up all night beside his bed. I remembered selling my own belongings to pay for his education. I had believed that love meant protection, that family meant support. That belief shattered in the rain. The ambulance lights finally cut through the darkness, reflecting off the wet pavement. The paramedics moved quickly, covering me with a blanket and lifting me onto a stretcher. The warmth of the vehicle felt almost unreal after the cold night air. As the doors closed behind us, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I understood then that I could no longer rely on others to protect me. My body was fragile, but my mind was still strong. The pain in my hip would heal, but the truth I had discovered about my family would stay with me forever. As the ambulance pulled away from my home, I watched the rain blur the familiar outline of the porch and the windows. That house had once been a symbol of safety and stability. Now, it felt like a reminder of how alone I truly was. I did not know what the future would bring, but I knew one thing with certainty. From that night forward, I would take control of my own life, no matter how difficult the road ahead became. If you're still here and starting to sense something darker beneath the surface, comment number 2 below to show your support. The next chapter reveals a truth that changed everything. Let's continue to chapter 3. I woke up to the steady beeping of a heart monitor and the harsh glow of fluorescent lights above my bed. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and unfamiliar compared to the salty breeze of my home by the ocean. My hip throbbed with a deep, aching pain, and every small movement reminded me of the fall from the night before. A nurse adjusted my blanket and told me I had suffered a pelvic fracture. I would need to stay in the hospital for observation and rehabilitation. As the hours passed, I watched other patients receive visits from their families. Sons brought flowers, daughters held hands, and grandchildren ran through the halls with quiet laughter. My bedside remained empty. No familiar voices, no comforting presence, just the soft hum of machines and the distant footsteps of the hospital staff. Late in the afternoon, my phone finally buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. He asked about my insurance information and whether the hospital accepted my provider. There was no mention of my condition, no concern for how I was feeling. The message felt more like a business inquiry than a note from a worried son. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one was from Claire. She asked if the house was still fully in my name and whether any paperwork had changed recently. The question caught me off guard. Lying in a hospital bed with a fractured pelvis, the last thing on my mind was property ownership. Yet for her, it seemed to be a priority. The doctor returned in the evening to discuss my recovery. He explained that I would need assistance at home for daily activities once I was discharged. Walking, cooking, and even bathing would be difficult for a while. When Ethan finally called, the conversation was brief and practical. He suggested that a nursing home might be the easiest solution. It would be more convenient for everyone, he said, and I would have professional care. His words felt like a quiet dismissal, as if I were an obligation to be managed rather than a mother to be cared for. I had spent decades supporting him, sacrificing my own comfort to give him stability. Now, at my most vulnerable, I was being gently pushed aside. After the call ended, I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Memories of the past filled my thoughts. I remembered working long night shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted but still cooking dinner for Ethan. I remembered attending every school event, every milestone, every small victory in his life. I had believed that love was something that lasted forever, something that could not be replaced by convenience or money. Yet here I was, alone in a hospital room, realizing that my value in my son's life had changed. The nurse checked my vital signs and asked if I had anyone who could stay with me during my recovery. I hesitated before answering, saying my son no longer felt accurate. Instead, I simply said that I would manage. As the room grew quieter, a new thought formed in my mind. For the first time, I began to wonder about my own security. The house by the ocean was not just a home filled with memories. It was also my only significant asset. If something happened to me, I had no clear plan in place. I had always assumed that my family would handle things responsibly. Now, that assumption felt fragile. I remember Thomas Reed, an old family lawyer who had helped us with paperwork years ago. He was thorough, careful, and honest. The idea of speaking with him brought me a sense of control that I had not felt since the accident. The next morning, with my hips still aching and my heart heavy, I asked the nurse for my phone. I searched for Thomas's office number and made the call. My voice was steady, even though my hands were not. I told his assistant that I needed to review my property documents and discuss my legal options. When I ended the call, I felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. I was stepping into unfamiliar territory, but I knew I could not afford to remain passive. The hospital room, once just a place of recovery, had become the setting for a quiet awakening. I was still a mother, still a woman who had lived a full life of service and sacrifice, but I was also someone who needed to protect herself. The fall had injured my body, but it had opened my eyes even more. And I was finally ready to see the truth. If you're still watching and wondering how far this situation could really go, comment number 3 so I know you're following closely. What happened next crossed a line that can never be undone. Let's move on to Chapter 4. The morning I left the hospital to meet Thomas Reed, the sky was pale and quiet, as if the storm from days earlier had never existed. My hips still ached with every step, and I relied heavily on my cane as I made my way into the lawyer's office in downtown Cape Cod. The building was old, with polished wooden floors and framed certificates lining the walls. I had walked through these doors years ago with my husband, never imagining I would return under such circumstances. Thomas greeted me kindly and led me into his office. His calm, professional manner gave me a sense of stability that I had not felt since my fall. He reviewed my identification and pulled up the property records for my house by the ocean. As he examined the documents, he confirmed what I had hoped to hear. The house was still entirely in my name. Ethan had no legal authority to sell it, transfer it, or make decisions about it without my consent. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. That house represented more than just money. It held the memories of my marriage, my son's childhood, and decades of my life. Knowing that it was still mine gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. Then Thomas's expression changed. He hesitated before showing me another set of documents. These were related to a recent loan application filed with a local bank. The papers included a signature that was supposed to be mine, but as soon as I saw it, I knew something was wrong. The handwriting was similar, but not quite right. The curves of the letters were too sharp, the pressure uneven. Thomas explained that the application had been submitted by Claire. The purpose was to use my house as collateral for a mortgage loan. The bank had not approved it yet because certain details did not match their records. They had flagged the signature for review. My hands trembled as I stared at the document. The betrayal I felt in that moment was deeper than anything I had experienced before. Claire had not only dismissed my pain during the storm, but she had also attempted to use my property without my knowledge. It was not just disrespect, it was deception. A rush of memories flooded my mind. I thought about the money I had given Ethan and Claire to help them build their life together. I remembered every sacrifice, every compromise, every moment I had chosen their needs over my own. Now, I was being treated like an obstacle rather than a mother. Thomas told me that what Claire had done could be considered fraud. He advised me to keep copies of the documents and to remain cautious. Legal action was an option, but the choice was mine. As I left the office, my emotions were tangled. I felt anger, sadness, and disbelief all at once. Yet beneath those feelings, something else was forming: determination. I decided not to confront Ethan or Claire right away. If they were willing to go this far, I needed to understand the full extent of their intentions. I wanted to know how deep their plans went. I began keeping detailed notes of every suspicious interaction, every unusual change in my home, every financial question they asked. When I returned to my house, I noticed small differences that I had once ignored. Boxes in the hallway, items moved from their usual places. The subtle sense that my space was no longer entirely mine. I walked slowly through each room, taking mental notes, observing rather than reacting. For the first time in my life, I stopped seeing myself as a passive figure in my own story. I was no longer just a mother who gave and gave without question. I was a woman who had earned her independence, her home, and her dignity. The pain in my hip reminded me of my physical vulnerability, but the fire in my chest reminded me of my strength. I had survived loss, long hours, and years of sacrifice. I could survive betrayal too. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the ocean breeze drifted through my open windows, I sat quietly in my living room. I held the copied documents in my hands, reading them again and again. Each word felt like a reminder that I needed to protect myself. I did not know how this would end, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not allow my life's work to be taken from me without a fight. If you're still with me and feeling the tension rise, comment number 4 below, because from this point on, nothing in this house would ever be the same. Now, let's move into chapter 5. When I returned home after meeting with Thomas Reed, something felt wrong the moment I stepped through the front door. The familiar scent of ocean air had been replaced by the smell of unfamiliar perfume and strong cooking spices. The living room looked crowded, as if more people were living there than before. Shoes I did not recognize were lined up near the entrance, and a stack of suitcases sat against the wall. I walked slowly toward the hallway, leaning on my cane. My heart tightened with each step. When I reached my bedroom, I stopped in shock. The room no longer belonged to me. The curtains had been changed. My bedspread was gone. The dresser that once held my personal belongings was now covered in unfamiliar cosmetics and decorative items. My framed photographs had been removed from the nightstand and placed carelessly in a cardboard box. My clothes were no longer in the closet. Instead, they had been stuffed into plastic bins and pushed into the storage room. It felt as though someone had erased my presence from the space I had shared with my husband for decades. From the kitchen, I heard voices speaking casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. Claire's parents had moved in. They were unpacking groceries and chatting comfortably, treating the house like their own. No one had asked for my permission. No one had even informed me. Claire appeared in the hallway a moment later. She looked confident, almost satisfied. She explained that it made sense for her parents to use the main bedroom since they were older and needed more comfort. She also suggested that I did not really need such a large space anymore. Her words were calm, but they carried a sharp edge. I realized that in her eyes, I was no longer the owner of this home. I was simply someone taking up room. I said nothing. I did not raise my voice or demand answers. Outwardly, I remained quiet and composed, but inside, my emotions were crashing into each other. Anger, sadness, and disbelief twisted together in my chest. I slowly walked through the rest of the house. Furniture had been rearranged. My favorite chair was gone. The shelves that once held my books were now filled with decorations that meant nothing to me. Even the family photographs had been replaced by framed images of Claire's side of the family. Every corner of the house reminded me that I was being pushed aside. That night, I sat alone in the small guest room they had assigned to me. The bed was narrow, the walls bare, and the air felt heavy. I held one of my old photographs in my hands, a picture of my husband and me standing on this very porch many years ago. Back then, the house was full of laughter, dreams, and shared effort. Now, it felt like a place I no longer belonged. But I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, I began to observe. Over the next few days, I quietly documented everything. I took photographs of my moved belongings, the changes to my bedroom, and the extra residents who had settled in without my consent. I wrote down dates, times, and details in a small notebook I kept hidden in my drawer. Claire and her parents continued to act as if the house were already theirs. Conversations about renovations and space improvements filled the air. They spoke about comfort, convenience, and future plans, never once considering how I felt. With each passing day, my role in the household became clearer. I was no longer the matriarch. I was an obstacle. Yet something inside me had changed. The woman who once avoided conflict was gone. In her place stood someone who had survived loss, hardship, and betrayal. I had spent my life caring for others, but now it was time to care for myself. The house might no longer feel like mine, but legally, it still was, and I was not finished fighting for it. As I closed my notebook that evening, I felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over me. Whatever plans Claire had, I would uncover them. Whatever she intended to take from me, I would protect. This was no longer just about a house. It was about dignity. Over the following week, I began to notice changes in Claire's behavior. She left the house earlier than usual, always dressed neatly, her makeup carefully done. When she returned, she seemed distracted, her eyes fixed on her phone, her voice short and guarded. Conversations that once happened openly now stopped whenever I entered the room. Her phone was always on silent, the screen turned face down on the table. I did not ask questions. I had learned that silence could be more powerful than confrontation. One afternoon, while running a small errand near the town center, I saw her sitting at a cafe across the street. She was not alone. A well-dressed man sat across from her, leaning in as they spoke. His hand rested casually on the table near hers. Their body language was too familiar to be professional. I paused behind the window of a nearby shop, my heart pounding quietly in my chest. The man looked familiar. I had seen his face on local real estate advertisements posted around Cape Cod. He was a property agent who specialized in coastal homes. That detail alone was enough to send a chill through me. They laughed softly. Claire brushed her hair back in a way I had never seen her do at home. The air between them was intimate, but what troubled me more was the folder resting on the table between them. It was thick, filled with papers. As I stepped closer to the cafe entrance, fragments of their conversation drifted toward me. They mentioned pricing, timing, and paperwork. There was talk about how soon everything could be finalized. I heard a reference to transferring ownership and avoiding unnecessary delays. They were not talking about business at her office. They were talking about my house. A cold wave passed through my body. This was not just betrayal within a marriage. This was a calculated plan to take something that did not belong to her. She was preparing to sell my home without my knowledge, using connections and deception to make it happen. I walked away before they noticed me, my cane tapping softly against the pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last. Back at the house, the familiar walls no longer offered comfort. Every room seemed to whisper reminders of what was at stake. The framed photos, the quiet corners, the view of the ocean at sunset, all of it could disappear with a single forged signature and a hidden transaction. My thoughts spiraled. I imagined confronting her, demanding explanations, exposing her lies, but then I remembered Thomas Reed's calm voice and steady advice. Emotions could cloud judgment. Evidence, however, could protect me. That night, as the house settled into silence, I sat at the small desk in my room and reviewed my notes. I added a new entry describing the cafe meeting, the man's identity, and the words I had overheard. I carefully labeled each page, making sure nothing was left to memory alone. I was no longer just observing. I was preparing. The pain in my hip still reminded me of my physical limits, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I had spent decades solving problems quietly, holding families together, making sacrifices without recognition. Now, I was directing that strength toward protecting myself. Claire returned home late that evening, her expression unreadable. She barely acknowledged me as she walked past, disappearing into the master bedroom that once belonged to me. The door closed softly, but the message was loud and clear. I sat in the dim light of my room, listening to the distant sound of waves beyond the windows. The house may have felt occupied by strangers, but my resolve had never been stronger. I had reached a crossroads. One path led to silence and surrender. The other led to action, protection, and dignity. I chose the second. Whatever plans Claire and her accomplice were making, they would not unfold the way they expected. I was no longer just a woman recovering from a fall. I was the rightful owner of my life, my home, and my future. If you're still watching and shocked by what was just uncovered, comment number 6 to let me know you're here. The consequences of this discovery were about to shake the entire family. Let's move on to Chapter 7. The atmosphere inside the house shifted almost overnight. What had once been quiet, even if uncomfortable, became tense and unpredictable. Voices rose behind closed doors. Footsteps echoed through the hallways at odd hours. Claire and Ethan no longer spoke to each other with ease. Their conversations were sharp, clipped, and often ended in silence. I stayed in my small room most of the time, listening rather than interfering. The walls carried more truth than anyone realized. Ethan began coming home later, his face tight with worry. He stopped greeting me the way he used to, not out of anger, but because his mind seemed elsewhere. Papers were left scattered on the dining table, bank statements, envelopes from unfamiliar institutions, and folded documents appeared and disappeared without explanation. One evening, I heard raised voices from the master bedroom. Claire's tone was defensive, sharp with irritation. Ethan's voice, usually calm, carried frustration. Money was mentioned. So was the house. I did not need to hear every word to understand what was happening. Over the next few days, Ethan's behavior changed. He started asking questions that had never crossed his mind before. He examined paperwork more carefully. He made phone calls in hushed tones. The trust he once placed in Claire was beginning to crack. The truth, as it often does, found its way to the surface. One afternoon, Ethan confronted Claire about a loan application connected to the house. The forged signature, the suspicious paperwork, and the unanswered questions finally became too much to ignore. Claire denied everything at first, but her explanations were inconsistent, her stories tangled in half-truths. The betrayal Ethan felt was not just financial, it was personal. He had trusted his wife with his family, his future, and his mother's well-being. Now he realized that trust had been misplaced. Claire's frustration soon turned into anger. She accused Ethan of choosing his mother over her. She claimed I was selfish, that I was hoarding wealth instead of helping the family move forward. Her words were filled with resentment, as if my independence were an obstacle to her ambitions. From my room, I felt no urge to defend myself. I had already accepted the truth long before Ethan had. What hurt me once no longer had the power to shock me. Instead, I observed the consequences of choices made without integrity. The house, once a place of shared memories, became a battlefield of blame and disappointment. Doors slammed. Conversations ended abruptly. The emotional distance between Ethan and Claire grew wider each day. Ethan began spending more time outside the home, avoiding the tension he could no longer ignore. His face carried the weight of regret. He was realizing that protecting his marriage had come at the cost of overlooking my dignity. Claire, on the other hand, grew increasingly restless. Her confidence faded into defensiveness. She paced the house, muttering under her breath, checking her phone constantly. The comfort she once enjoyed was slipping through her fingers. Through it all, I remained silent. Silence, I had learned, was not weakness. It was patience. I had gathered my evidence. I had watched their plans unravel. And now, the consequences were unfolding exactly as they should. The truth did not need my voice to speak for it. As I sat by the window one evening, watching the ocean waves roll in under the fading sunlight, I felt a quiet sense of clarity. The chaos in the house no longer frightened me. It confirmed what I already knew. I had done the right thing by protecting myself, and soon it would be time to take the next step. I realized that waiting any longer would only allow the situation to grow worse. Claire's plans were no longer hidden, and the tension inside the house had become unbearable. Every hallway felt heavy with unspoken conflict. I knew it was time to stop observing and start acting. A few days later, I returned to Thomas Reed's office, carrying a folder filled with documents, photographs, and my handwritten notes. My hands were steady this time. I was no longer confused or uncertain. I was prepared. Thomas carefully reviewed everything: the forged signature, the suspicious loan application, the photographs of my belongings being moved, and my detailed timeline of events. His expression remained calm, but his words were firm. What Claire had attempted was not just unethical, it was illegal. The real estate agent involved had also violated professional standards. For the first time since my fall, I felt fully supported by the law. Thomas explained my options clearly. I could pursue criminal charges, but that would likely cause long legal battles and public exposure. Another path was to take immediate civil action, reclaim full control of my property, and demand that Claire and her parents leave the house. I chose the second option. This was not about revenge. It was about dignity. Thomas drafted a formal legal notice stating my ownership rights and demanding that unauthorized occupants vacate the property. The letter outlined the fraudulent activity, the misuse of my property, and the legal consequences of continued interference. When the notice was delivered, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. Claire's confidence disappeared. Her movements became rushed, her tone sharp and defensive. Ethan, caught between shock and disbelief, struggled to process what was happening. The reality he had avoided for so long was now undeniable. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. For years, I had placed my trust in family, believing love would always protect me. But love without respect becomes a burden, not a blessing. Protecting myself did not make me cold or selfish. It made me wise. That evening, I sat alone in my room, listening to the steady rhythm of the ocean outside. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place I was finally reclaiming. I was not erasing my past. I was securing my future. The woman who once stayed silent out of fear was gone. In her place stood someone who understood her worth, her rights, and her strength. Whatever consequences came next, I would face them standing tall. If you're still here and ready to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below. The final outcome is emotional, powerful, and unforgettable. Let's move to the conclusion. Claire and her parents left the house on a gray morning, their departure as cold and quiet as the tension that had filled the walls for weeks. Suitcases were dragged across the floor, doors opened and closed without a word, and not once did Claire look in my direction. The legal notice had ended all arguments. There was nothing left for her to claim. When the last car pulled away from the driveway, the silence felt unfamiliar. For the first time in months, the house belonged to me again. The air seemed lighter. The rooms no longer felt crowded with resentment or ambition. My belongings were returned to their rightful places, and the master bedroom slowly regained its warmth. Yet beneath the calm, there was an emptiness that could not be ignored. Family, even when broken, leaves echoes behind. Ethan remained in the house for a few days, moving through the rooms with a heaviness I had never seen before. He avoided eye contact, his shoulders slumped with regret. The reality of what he had allowed to happen weighed on him more than any argument ever could. One evening, we sat in the living room as the sun faded over the ocean. The waves rolled steadily, indifferent to the changes inside our lives. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. He admitted that he had failed to protect me, that he had ignored the warning signs because it was easier than facing the truth. I did not respond with anger. There was no need. I told him that love without boundaries becomes a weakness. Respect is not proven by words, but by actions. A mother's role is not to sacrifice her dignity to keep the peace. It is to show her child how to stand firm in the face of injustice. Ethan listened quietly. There were no excuses left to offer. A few days later, he told me he planned to move out. He wanted to rebuild his life on his own terms, without leaning on my stability or my sacrifices. It was not an easy decision for him, but it was necessary. As I watched him pack his belongings, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only acceptance. The house returned to its familiar rhythm. Mornings were filled with ocean light. Evenings were calm. I began spending more time on the porch, letting the sea breeze remind me that life continues, no matter how painful the chapters before it were. I started thinking about what I wanted next, not for my family, not for anyone else, for myself. I had spent decades living for others. Now, it was time to live for me. The storm had passed, but it had left behind clarity. And with that clarity came peace. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful and entirely my own. The house, once filled with tension and unspoken resentment, now held only the gentle sounds of the ocean and the quiet comfort of familiar spaces. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the floors and reminding me that I was still here, still standing. My body healed little by little. The ache in my hip faded and my strength returned. But more importantly, my heart felt lighter. I no longer lived with the constant worry of being taken advantage of. I no longer questioned my place in my own life. Looking back, I saw how easily love can blur into sacrifice, and sacrifice into silence. For years, I believed that being a good mother meant enduring anything for the sake of family. I thought patience meant acceptance, and forgiveness meant forgetting. But the truth was far simpler and far stronger. Respect must be mutual. Love without boundaries is not love. It is control. What happened to me was painful, but it opened my eyes. Age does not erase dignity. A woman does not lose her worth simply because she grows older. Our stories, our homes, and our lives belong to us. I learned that standing up for myself did not make me cold or unforgiving. It made me honest. In the quiet evenings, I often sat on the porch, watching the sun sink into the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, calm and unbothered by the storms that once raged inside my home. I breathed in the salty air and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Freedom. Not the freedom to escape, but the freedom to choose, to live without fear, to protect what I had built, to love without losing myself. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, I smiled softly, knowing that this chapter of my life was not an ending. It was a beginning. True strength is not found in anger or revenge, but in the courage to protect one's own dignity. Life teaches us that love without boundaries can slowly turn into sacrifice, and sacrifice without respect can become loss. Every person, regardless of age, deserves to be seen, valued, and heard. When we choose to stand up for ourselves, we are not rejecting others, we are honoring our own worth. Painful experiences often become the doorway to clarity. They remind us that independence is not selfish, that self-respect is not coldness, and that peace is sometimes born from difficult choices. Growth does not come from comfort, but from truth. Thank you for spending this time with us and reflecting on this journey. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more meaningful stories about life, family, and resilience.